They say you can never truly go home again. But Major David Mitchell never expected to find his peaceful childhood neighborhood transformed into a war zone by the time the dust settled that fateful night. It was a terrible, terrible thing to see. 12 motorcycles lay scattered across the community center parking lot, their owners in handcuffs and the man they called the judge. He learned a tough lesson about the difference between terrorizing innocent people and facing a trained combat veteran. But that's getting ahead of our story. Let's go back to understand how a quiet suburban neighborhood became a battlefield and how one retired Special Forces operator dismantled the most feared motorcycle gang in 3 counties. Before we jump into today's story, let's go back to where it all began. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, and if you enjoy stories like this, please hit that subscribe button. We've got another amazing tale waiting for you tomorrow. David Mitchell stood on the sidewalk, staring at his grandmother's house. Victorian house. As the setting sun painted the sky in shapes of orange and purple, oh my, it's already 6 p.m. On a lovely warm evening, it was so quiet. No children playing in their yards, no neighbors chatting over fences, and even the usual dog walkers were absent. The familiar creak of the third porch step brought a flood of memories. David had fixed that loose board countless times during high school, after his parents' accident had sent him to live with Gran. She'd always said it was her personal alarm system, so nobody could sneak in without that board announcing their presence. Now it announced his homecoming, but sadly, Gran wasn't there to welcome him. Cancer had taken her just 3 months ago. David had been deployed on his final mission for a while now, and he was back home again. He set his military duffel bag down and methodically checked each room, an old habit he couldn't break. Everything was exactly as Gran had left it, just as he remembered it. There was the collection of porcelain angels on the mantelpiece, the worn armchair where she had taught him to read, and the flag display case that had draped his grandfather's coffin at Arlington. But something felt a little off about the house's stillness. The sound of motorcycles shattered the evening quiet, not just 1 or 2, but several. 2 bikes, but many more. Their engines were deliberately loud. David moved to the window and watched as 8 riders roared past. They wore black leather vests bearing a distinctive emblem, a snarling wolf's head surrounded by chains. The lead rider turned his head and caught David's eye through the window. Even at a distance, the man's smirk was visible. A soft knock at the back door pulled David's attention away from the window. Mrs. Martinez, his grandmother's best friend for 30 years, stood on the porch, glancing over her shoulder. Her silver hair was perfectly styled as always, but her hands trembled as she clutched her handbag. "David, thank God you're finally here," she whispered, hurrying inside. "Your grandmother tried to stop them. She tried so hard to stop Mrs. Martinez and the Iron Wolves. They moved in 6 months ago and bought the old community center. At first it was just noise, but now," she pulled up her sleeve, revealing dark bruises on her wrist. "They demand protection money, weekly payments. Your grandmother refused to pay, said she wouldn't be bullied in her own home. That's when the harassment started." David started to speak, but his jaw tightened. He told her everything over the next hour. Mrs. Martinez painted a picture of systematic intimidation. The Iron Wolves, led by a man known as the Judge, had transformed the peaceful suburb into their personal fiefdom. Small businesses had to pay protection money. Residents lived in fear. The local police seemed powerless or unwilling to help. Mrs. Martinez's voice cracked. She organized meetings and tried to get people to stand together. But after they vandalized the Thompsons' grocery store and broke poor Mr. Wong's windows, nobody dared resist anymore. Nobody wanted to risk it anymore. The stress, the constant fear. It didn't help with her condition. David's hand clenched into a fist. He'd been fighting terrorists in far-off lands while his grandmother faced her own battle at home. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, the same weight he'd carried leading men in combat. A police siren wailed in the distance, then quickly fell silent. Mrs. Martinez flinched at the sound. "They own some of the police," she explained. "Reports disappear, evidence vanishes. Even the FBI agent who came to investigate suddenly got transferred." David said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority that had steadied his men through countless missions. "Tell me about their operations, everything you know." As Mrs. Martinez detailed the Iron Wolves' activities, David's military training kicked in. He mentally mapped patrol patterns, noted vulnerable points, identified potential assets and threats. This wasn't so different from analyzing insurgent activities in hostile territory. "The Judge," Mrs. Martinez continued. "Can you believe it? Marcus Rodriguez used to be a lawyer. He got disbarred for jury tampering 5 years ago. Now he runs the gang like it's his personal court system. He sets the fines and decides the punishments. Those who can't pay, well, they're in trouble. Outside, there was a commotion. Drew looked out the window and saw 3 bikers surrounding old Mr. Wong, who was closing his convenience store. Even from a distance, their threatening postures were clear. They demanded double the usual payment. One biker demanded his voice carrying across the quiet street. Judge says, "Oh, Mr. Wong, you've been late too often." He'd given David free candy throughout his childhood, but now he seemed to shrink into himself. "Please, business is slow, and my wife's medical bills are a worry." The largest biker grabbed Mr. Wong's collar. "Maybe we need to help you understand how business works around here." David was moving before conscious thought took over. Mrs. Martinez grabbed his arm. "David, no, they'll hurt you like they hurt the others who tried to help." He gently removed her hand. "Mrs. Martinez, they don't know what hurt is, but they're about to find out." David stepped out onto his porch, 20 years of special forces training guiding his movements. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step purposeful. The evening light caught his grandmother's flag in the window behind him, and in that moment, David Mitchell made a silent promise. This was his home, and he was about to teach the Iron Wolves that they'd made a fatal mistake. They'd brought a street fight to a war veteran. As David approached the largest biker, the harsh shadows cast by Mr. Wong's store fell across the parking lot. The biker still had his hand on Mr. Wong's collar, but his attention shifted to David's measured footsteps on the asphalt. "Evening, gentle gem," David said softly. "I believe Mr. Wong explained his situation clearly," the biker replied. The 3 bikers exchanged glances before the largest one, wearing a vest that identified him as Spike, released Mr. Wong with a shove. "Well, look who it is," the biker said. "The new guy. Mind your own business, soldier boy. You made it my business when you put hands on Mr. Wong." David positioned himself between Mr. Wong and the bikers, placing himself between them like a protective shield. He looked at Spike with a calm, reassuring gaze. Spike laughed, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes as he studied David's stance. David's 20 years of combat had left their mark, not in obvious scars or medals, but in the way he carried himself with a calm confidence that came from facing real danger. He spoke gently but firmly. "Listen up, tough guy. You don't make arrangements. The judge makes arrangements, and right now, he's arranged for old man Wong here to pay double behind David," Mr. Wong whispered. "Please, Major Mitchell, don't cause trouble. They will burn my store like they did with Chenk Restaurant." "No, they won't," David replied, still keeping his eyes on Spike. "These gentlemen are about to learn something important about this neighborhood. It's protected now." The shortest biker, a wiry man with snake tattoos covering his neck, pulled out a switchblade. The click of the blade opening echoed in the quiet lot. "Protected by who you buy, all of us," David smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "See, I've spent the last 20 years learning about protection, real protection, not extortion dressed up as security, and I've gotten very, very good at dealing with people who confuse the two." Spike took a step forward, cracking his knuckles. "It's your last chance to walk away, soldier boy. I'm sure you don't want to explain to the judge why we had to mess up that pretty uniform of yours." "I'm not wearing a uniform anymore," David said quietly, "which means I'm not bound by military rules of engagement. Think carefully about your next move." The 3rd biker was silent until now. "Spike's arm," I grabbed Spike's arm. "Hold up, this guy, I heard about him. Special Forces, 3 silver stars, my cousin served with him in Afghanistan." Spike shrugged off the warning. "I don't care if he's Captain America, nobody disrespects the Iron Wolves." He swung a meaty fist at David's face. What happened next became a neighborhood legend. David moved with liquid grace, deflecting the punch and using Spike's momentum to send him sprawling. The snake-tattooed biker lunged with his knife, but David caught his wrist, twisted, and the blade clattered to the ground. With its owner, the 3rd biker, backing away, hands raised, David said, "Hey man, we're just doing our job." "Your job?" His voice carried across the lot. "Your job is terrorizing elderly shopkeepers, ERS, burning businesses, beating up people who can't fight back." He turned to Spike, who was struggling to his feet, and said, "Tell your judge I want to meet him tomorrow night at the community center." Spike spat blood onto the pavement. "You're dead, soldier boy. You hear me? Dead." "I've heard that before." David replied calmly from better. "Men than you tomorrow night, don't keep me waiting." As the bikers retreated to their motorcycles, a small crowd gathered at the edges of the car park. David could see fear in their eyes, but something else too, a spark of hope. Mr. Wong clutched David's arm. Major Mitchell, you don't understand. The judge has connections. He has friends in high places. Even judges, real judges, they will hurt you. Mr. Wong, when I was 14, you caught me trying to steal a candy bar. Instead of calling the police, you gave me a job. Sweeping your store, you trusted me when nobody else would. Well, now it's my turn to return that trust. The crowd grew larger, and David recognized faces from his childhood. Mrs. Peterson from the bakery, Coach Thompson who'd taught him football, and the Martinez twins who'd grown into young men. All were watching and wondering if change was finally possible. Listen to me, David raised his voice to address the gathering. I know you're scared, he said. The Iron Wolves have ruled through fear for too long, but fear only works when we're stronger together than we could ever be alone. A police car drove slowly past, but its occupants didn't stop. David noted the vehicle number. Tomorrow would be about more than just confronting the judge. It would be about exposing everyone who enabled the Iron Wolves' reign of terror back home. David found Mrs. Martinez waiting anxiously on his porch. I saw what happened, she said. Your grandmother would be proud. The judge doesn't fight fair, David replied. Neither do I. David walked into his house and opened his duffel bag. Under his clothes, he found a small case containing everything he'd need. Not weapons, but something far more dangerous to men like the judge. Evidence for the next several hours. David made calls to old contacts. He called a state police captain who he'd known from their days in the Rangers. He also called an FBI agent he'd worked with on counterterrorism. Finally, he called a deputy district attorney who he'd saved the day for in Kandahar. By midnight, he'd made all the calls. Grandma's dining room table was covered in papers, photos, and maps. The Iron Wolves had been careful, but they'd never faced someone trained in military intelligence. Every protection payment, every act of vandalism, every corrupt cop, it all formed a pattern. Patterns could be broken. A text message lit up his phone. You're dead, soldier boy. The judges sends his regards. David smiled. They still didn't understand. They thought this was about territory, about power, about fear, but they were wrong. This was about justice, and tomorrow night the Iron Wolves would learn what happened when they brought their street tactics against a man who'd spent his life training for real war outside. A motorcycle engine roared past his house, then another. They were watching, trying to intimidate him, but David Mitchell had stared down warlords and terrorists. The Iron Wolves were about to discover they'd made a fatal mistake. They'd threatened the wrong veteran's home. Dawn broke over Cedar Grove and David had spent the night studying satellite images of the neighborhood. Another skill from his military days that was about to prove useful. The Iron Wolves' patrol patterns were sloppy and predictable. They never expected anyone to study them this closely. A soft knock at his door revealed Officer Sarah Chun, looking nervous in her crisp uniform. Major Mitchell, she said. I worked with your grandmother on the neighborhood watch before the Iron Wolves shut it down. David gestured for her to come in. To enter the department, Chun glanced over her shoulder. There's not much we can do, she said sadly. They have pictures and videos of officers taking money, and evidence disappears. Witnesses have changed their stories, and I think it's because officers like David and Sergeant Reynolds, Lieutenant Harris, and maybe others have been doing a great job, but they don't get the credit they deserve. Chun pulled out a small notebook. I've been keeping records, but my captain says to drop it. David studied the young officer. Why are you telling me this? Your grandmother was threatened when they started threatening businesses. She was the only one who stood up and said that someone had to fight back. Chen's eyes filled with tears. 2 days later, they broke into her house. The stress and heartache were overwhelming. David's jaw tightened. They broke in, but that wasn't in the police report. There was no report. Reynolds lost the paperwork. Chun straightened her shoulders. She said, I became a cop to protect people, not to watch thugs terrorize innocent citizens. That night, David said, things change, but I need you to do something for me. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was. The air was alive with whispers as people shared their thoughts on what had happened at Wong's store. It was as if something had sparked a feeling of hope, but it was also a restless energy. The Iron Wolves had responded by flooding the streets with members, and their presence was more aggressive than usual. David watched from his porch as 3 bikers harassed Mrs. Peterson, demanding immediate payment for extra protection. The poor old woman's hands shook as she counted out bills from her retirement check. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, last chance. Soldier boy, you'd better leave town or we'll burn everything you care about, starting with Granny's house. David's response was simple. Come try inside. When Hall knocked on his back door, it was Tommy, Mr. Wong's teenage son, who answered. He whispered, "Dad sent me. He wants you to have this." He handed Hall a USB drive with security camera footage. Tommy explained that his father had been saving it, along with every payment and threat, because he was too scared to show it to the police. "Your father's a brave man," Tommy said. "They broke his arm last month. They said it was a warning." Tommy's eyes hardened. "Make them pay," he said. By the afternoon, more people had come forward. Mrs. Martinez brought her late husband's old ham radio set, which was perfect. For secure communications, the wonderful Coach Thompson offered his hunting cabin as a safe house. Even Mr. Chun, whose restaurant had been burned down, provided documentation of suspicious insurance claim denials. David's dining room became an operation center, with maps marked with patrol routes, lists of corrupted officials, and financial records showing money movements. The Iron Wolves had created their own little kingdom, but they'd never faced an enemy who understood asymmetrical warfare. A commotion outside drew his attention. Oh dear! 2 bikers were spray painting threats on his garage door. David watched calmly through his security cameras, which he'd had installed just last night. They were recording everything. The bikers took special pleasure in desecrating his grandmother's prized rose bushes. Officer Chun called with an update. "They're feeling nervous." The judge called an emergency meeting. "Every member has been ordered to the community center tonight. Make sure you're ready. The State Police Tactical Unit is on standby." "Standby, FBI 2. David Chun paused for a moment. "These guys aren't just thugs, you know. The judge enjoys hurting people, bless his heart." David checked his watch. He had an hour to prepare for tonight. He spent the next hour calling his volunteers. They were veterans from 3 wars who lived in the area. They were men and women who understood duty. They remembered what it meant to protect their home. Mr. Jenkins, a Vietnam vet, positioned himself in the bell tower of St. Michael's Church. He had a perfect overview of the community center. The Martinez twins, both ex, the Marines took up positions covering the back exits, every approach and every escape route. As the sun was setting, David made one final call to his FBI contact. He wanted to check in and make sure everything was going well. The agent confirmed that they had everything they needed to take down the entire operation. David hung up the phone and walked to his grandmother's flag case. Inside, hidden in the frame, was a small recording device. It was military grade and had been used by David during his time in the Special Forces. Mrs. Martinez appeared at his door for one last time. "David, please be careful," she said. "These men, bless their hearts, they're just animals, Mrs. Martinez. You know, animals kill for food or survival. These men do it for pleasure." He checked his watch. "That's why they need to be stopped." Outside, motorcycles roared in the distance. Dozens of them. The Iron Wolves were gathering for what they thought would be their victory. They didn't understand that David had spent 20 years learning the art of war. Tonight wouldn't be a street fight. It would be an operation. And the Iron Wolves were about to learn the difference between being predators and being prey. As darkness fell, David stepped out onto his porch, the flag case under his arm. It contained more than just a recording device. It also contained hope. Hope for a neighborhood living in fear. Hope for justice. The judge wanted to meet the man who dared challenge his authority. He was about to discover that he hadn't just picked a fight with a veteran. He'd started a war. The community center loomed against the darkening sky, its windows glowing with harsh fluorescent light. Once a place of neighborhood gatherings and children's programs, it had now become something else. The Iron Wolves' Fortress motorcycles were parked up outside. David counted 32 of them, plus 4 pickup trucks belonging to their associates in city government. His earpiece crackled. Bell Tower whispered, "Got eyes on 3 armed guards. The Martinez twins are checking in at the back alley. They're covered. They've got 2 men at." The service entrance officer, Chun, spoke next. He said that the state police units were in position and that the FBI tactical team was standing by. David walked alone down the middle of the street, with no weapons. He knew that the judge would be expecting him to be armed, but he carried his grandmother's flag case instead. He knew that what it represented would hurt the judge far more than any bullet. 2 big bikers blocked the entrance to the community center. They were looking for weapons, but David was calm. He told them, "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to negotiate." They patted him down roughly, then took him inside the main hall. This was where he'd attended his high school graduation. It had been transformed. Makeshift thrones sat on the old stage, surrounded by Iron Wolves members. The judge lounged there, every inch the fallen lawyer, in his expensive leather jacket and custom boots. Welcome, Major Mitchell. The judge's voice carried across the room. I've heard so much about you, Hero returns home. David studied his opponent, Marcus Rodriguez. Age 45. Disbarred for jury tampering, but he managed to avoid jail thanks to his connections. He built his gang through a combination of legal knowledge and calculated brutality. You've caused quite a stir. The judge continued interfering with legitimate business transactions, threatening my men. It's very disappointing. David's voice remained calm and collected. I'm sorry to say that you broke into my grandmother's house, which caused the stress that contributed to her death. The judge smiled and said, tragic accident. No police report filed as I recall, just like there won't be a report when they find what's left of you tomorrow. Laughter rippled through the gang members. David noted positions, weapons, exits, old habits that never. David passed away before we had a chance to chat about your future. He left me with some fascinating documents, including financial records, witness statements, and even footage of your tax assessor friend accepting bribes. I know that documents can sometimes be lost, and witnesses can change their minds. You're not the first person to try this. I know, but I'm the first to send copies to every law enforcement agency in 3 states and the major media outlets. I set the time release emails to send everything at midnight, but I can stop them now if you'd like. Oh, you're bluffing. David opened the flag case and removed a thick folder. Your protection racket brings in roughly 100. Oh, that's a lot of money. It's split between 30 core members, minus 40% kicked up to your friends in City Hall. That's why you needed to double Mr. Wong's payments to cover Lieutenant Harris's gambling debts. The judge looked a little upset. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. I spent 20 years gathering intelligence on warlords and terrorist cells. I really thought your bookkeeper password-protected Excel files would be a challenge. But I was wrong. David, I'm sorry, but I think you've been caught out. Some faces showed uncertainty, while others displayed fear. They'd never faced an opponent who'd done his homework. Spike, the judge barked. Show our guest what happens to people who spread lies. The large biker from the store confrontation stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. But David wasn't finished. Interesting timing, he continued. You tried to intimidate Mr. Wong exactly when your friend in the health department scheduled a surprise inspection. The judge's face showed his anger, but David was ready. He'd had 20 years of close combat training, so he was able to think quickly and act fast. He sidestepped the wild punch that Spike was trying to throw and used Spike's momentum to send him crashing into a table. 2 more bikers rushed in, but David was ready for them too. He moved with fluid efficiency, each strike precise and each movement economical. He shouted into his concealed mic, and windows shattered as flashbang grenades exploded. State police tactical teams rushed in. The teams were forced to retreat from the roof, while FBI agents burst through the side doors. The Martinez twins made a dramatic entrance through the back entrance, and chaos ensued. Some bikers tried to fight, while others ran. The judge was forced to scramble for a hidden exit, but found Mr. Jenkins blocking her path. He was carrying a hunting rifle and seemed to be heading somewhere. In less than 2 minutes, it was all over. David stood in the center of the room, surrounded by groaning bikers and the sounds of handcuffs clicking shut. The judge's face was bloodied. From resisting arrest, he glared at David. You think this changes anything? I have friends, powerful friends. You had friends, David. But they're all going down with you right now. FBI agents are raiding the homes of every official in your pocket. That includes Judge Harrison, who signed so many favorable rulings for you. Officer Chen approached, holding papers. Major Mitchell has arrest warrants for Reynolds and Harris. We're picking them up now. David nodded, then turned back to the judge. I think you might have made a classic mistake. You thought fear and violence were the ultimate weapons, but information is what really wins wars. As the Iron Wolves were led away in handcuffs, David retrieved his grandmother's flag case, which he'd hidden inside the recorder. He listened to everything, every word, every threat, every admission of corruption. He heard Mr. Jenkins whisper, Your grandmother would be proud, son. The neighbors had gathered, watching as their tormentors were loaded into police vans. The long nightmare was ending, but David knew his work wasn't finished. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, corrupted systems needed cleaning, damaged lives needed rebuilding, and a community needed to heal. But tonight, as he watched the judge being led away, David allowed himself a small smile. He'd fought wars in distant lands, but this victory here in his grandmother's neighborhood felt more significant than any medal he'd earned. The Iron Wolves had ruled through fear. They never understood that real strength comes from protecting others. Now they had all the time in the world to learn that lesson from inside a prison cell. Dawn broke over Cedar Grove differently the next morning. Children waited at bus stops without fear. Mrs. Peterson opened her bakery on time, not waiting for collectors. Mr. Wong's convenience store sign glowed proudly and the early morning light was shining brightly, but David knew better than to get too excited. After 20 years of military service, he'd learned that the aftermath of victory often proved more challenging than the battle itself. His phone had been ringing nonstop since midnight. FBI agents needed statements, the state police requested documentation, and local news wanted interviews. But the most important call came from Tommy Wong and Major Mitchell. The boy's voice was trembling as he said, "They're back, not the main gang, but there." David was already on his way to Dad's store when Tommy told him the good news. He'd been expecting this, as power vacuums always attract opportunists. Through his earpiece, he told his volunteer network, Mr. Jenkins, that he'd already got eyes on them. 4 bikes and 2 cars were already there, and it looked like they were trying to take over the Iron Wolves' territory. David reached the store just in time to see 5 men in Street King colors surrounding Mr. Wong. Their leader, a heavily tattooed man called Razor, was making their position clear. "Iron Wolves are gone." Razor grinned, but business continues. "Same arrangement. New management. The arrangement is over." David's voice cut through the morning air. "This neighborhood isn't accepting new management applications." Razor turned, studying David with cold eyes. "You caused quite a mess last night, Major Mitchell. You don't understand how things work. There's always someone ready to step in." David moved closer, noting positions and weapons with practiced ease. "You don't understand. The Iron Wolves didn't just lose their leaders, they exposed their entire network. Every corrupt cop, every bought official. Right now, the FBI is freezing accounts, seizing assets, and arresting collaborators." Razor's grin faltered slightly. "You think that matters? Streets don't care about FBI investigations. They care about profit. Take a look around. You'll see that every store has cameras now, connected to a secure network. Every transaction is recorded, and every thread is documented. The old system is gone." Through his earpiece, David heard the Martinez twins confirming positions. Mr. Jenkins had his scope trained on Razor from the church tower. Officer Chun had state police units on standby. "You're outnumbered." Razor stepped forward, in case you hadn't noticed. "I notice everything," David replied calmly. "Your hand keeps twitching towards your jacket. I can tell you're not used to carrying a gun. It's not comfortable. Your men keep looking over their shoulders because they know my people have them surrounded. Your car's engines are still running, which means you're not as confident as you pretend to be." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Razor's face. He hadn't expected this level of tactical analysis from a neighborhood watchdog. "David, you've got to leave. Now tell your friends this territory is protected, not by gangs, not by corrupt cops, but by the people who live here. People who aren't afraid anymore." Razor tried to maintain his tough facade, but David saw the calculations happening behind his eyes. The Iron Wolves' fall had changed the equation. Territory wasn't worth much if it came with federal attention. "This isn't over." Razor spat, backing toward his bike. "Actually, it is." David pulled out his phone because while we've been chatting, and it seems that facial recognition software has been running on my security feeds. It's so interesting to see what you have in Nevada. It would be a shame if that information reached local authorities. The Street Kings retreated, trying to look tough but fooling no one as their bikes roared away. Neighbors emerged from their shops and homes. Mr. Wong gripped David's arm. "They will tell others the old man worried that other gangs will come." "Let them come," David smiled. "Each time they'll find us stronger, better organized, and more united. That's how you win a war, not just by fighting battles, but by making the enemy know it's not worth it, day in, day out." David worked closely with Officer Chun and his volunteer network. Security cameras were installed at key locations, communication protocols were established, and the neighborhood watch was rebuilt with military precision. Mrs. Martinez brought coffee to the volunteers. "David, what you did, taking down the Iron Wolves, scaring off the Street Kings, it's incredible, but can we really keep this up?" David watched as children played freely in their yards for the first time in months. "We don't have a choice. Freedom isn't a one-time achievement. It requires constant vigilance." His phone buzzed with an update from the FBI agent he'd spoken to the night before. "Mitchell, you need to see this. We're finding connections between the Iron Wolves and bigger operations. Mexican cartel, gun runners, human trafficking. Your grandmother's neighborhood was just the tip of the iceberg. David thought about the scared faces he'd seen yesterday. The relieved ones today. Send me everything you have. If they want a war, we'll give them one. As evening approached, David sat on his grandmother's porch. He watched his neighbors reclaim their streets. The streets were empty, but he knew this was just the beginning. Other threats would come, but this time they wouldn't find scared victims. They'd find a community that was strong, organized, and led by someone who understood that real peace comes through strength, vigilance, and the unwavering commitment to protect what matters. The war for Cedar Grove was just beginning, and David Mitchell was ready to win it, not just for his grandmother's memory, but for every person who'd ever felt powerless against those who ruled through fear. He thought, let them come. They'll learn what the Iron Wolves learned, that they didn't just threaten a neighborhood, they threatened a soldier's home. Just 3 days after the Iron Wolves fell, David sat in his grandmother's study, reviewing intelligence reports. The FBI's investigation had uncovered some disturbing connections. It seemed that the judge's operation wasn't just about neighborhood extortion. It was a hub for larger criminal enterprises. Officer Chen arrived with fresh coffee and some not-so-great news. It seemed that some of the lower-ranking Iron Wolves were being released on bail due to legal technicalities and the judge's old connections. David nodded, his expression unchanging. He was unsurprised. They'll try to reorganize, rebuild their power base. That's why we're not waiting. He spread a map across the desk, marking locations with red pins. Every safe house, every stash spot, every meeting place the Iron Wolves used. We're not just defending anymore, he said. We're taking the fight to them. That's not exactly legal, Chen said, her voice worried. We're just going to make it impossible for them to operate, David replied. Watch and learn. His phone buzzed. Mr. Jenkins reporting from his observation post. It said, 3 former wolves at the Blue Moon Bar looked like they were having a rough day. Good David checked his watch right on schedule. He'd spent his military career studying enemy patterns and predicting responses. The Iron Wolves' remnants were a bit predictable, bless them. First they'd gather at their old haunts, then they'd try to reassert control through violence. But David had already changed the battlefield. Martinez twins, you copy? Operation Clean Sweep is a go. Across town, carefully orchestrated moves began. Health inspectors, honest ones this time, descended on Iron Wolves connected. Businesses and building inspectors found violations at their apartments. Traffic cops were keeping a close eye on them. One biker complained to Officer Chen, who replied, "This is law enforcement. Get used to it." By nightfall, the message was clear. Cedar Grove wouldn't be easy pickings anymore. But David knew the real challenges were still coming. His FBI contact called with urgent news. Mitchell, we've got movement. Cartel soldiers are arriving from down south. They're not happy about losing their distribution network. How many are there? At least 20 heavily armed men. These aren't street thugs, they're trained killers. David smiled grimly. So am I. He activated his volunteer network, veterans from 4 wars, each watching different sectors of the neighborhood. Mrs. Martinez's ham radio crackled with encoded updates. Contact Mr. Jenkins radioed the 3 SUVs with tinted windows, which were moving south on Maple. Martinez twins, you have eyes on the back rot. Affirmative. They're trying to set up a perimeter. David had expected this. The cartel wouldn't just send soldiers, they'd send professionals. But they didn't know that. We were walking into a prepared battlefield operation. He ordered, suddenly powerful floodlights blazed from rooftops and windows, illuminating every shadow where the cartel soldiers might hide. Security cameras pivoted, covering every angle, and motion sensors activated. One cartel soldier cursed as his tactical advantage vanished. David's voice carried through carefully placed speakers. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Cedar Grove. I see you brought weapons, which is a violation of local ordinances. I should mention you're currently surrounded. By the time the cartel soldiers realized what was going on, it was too late. They were surrounded by multiple law enforcement agencies, including FBI tactical teams and state police SWAT units. Even honest local cops tired of corruption had joined the operation. They had exactly 1 minute to surrender. After that, things got complicated. The cartel soldiers were good, but they weren't prepared for this level of coordination. They'd expected to intimidate a neighborhood, but they found themselves in a military-style ambush. This wasn't over. Their leader shouted as they retreated. David muttered, "I won't forget that either." Later that night, his volunteers gathered in his grandmother's living room. The Martinez twins brought pizza. Officer Chen provided updates on arrests. Mr. Jenkins cleaned his rifle while giving tactical assessments, and Officer Jenkins warned that cartels hate losing territory. David replied, "They'll find us stronger this time. This isn't just about defending anymore. It's about sending a message. Cedar Grove isn't just another target. It's a community that..." Mrs. Martinez brought coffee, her hands no longer shaking. "David, what you've done is a miracle. But can we really stand against a cartel? It just wouldn't work anymore." Cedar Grove had changed, and so had its people. Chun called his friends at the FBI and told them it was time for Phase 2, the complete takedown. She asked him about every cartel connection, every corrupt official, and every dirty cop still on their payroll. There was no more playing defense as his volunteers dispersed to their posts. David stood on his porch, watching his neighborhood lights glow in windows that had been dark for months. Children's laughter echoed from yards that had been silent. The Iron Wolves were gone, but the war for Cedar Grove was far from over. Grove's soul was far from over. The cartel would send more soldiers, other gangs would test their defenses, corruption would try to creep back in. But they would learn what the Iron Wolves learned, that they hadn't just threatened a neighborhood. They'd awakened a warrior who knew that. Some battles are worth any cost, and David Mitchell was just getting started. Sunrise painted Cedar Grove in shades of amber as David reviewed the night's intelligence reports. The cartel's failed intimidation attempt had changed the game, escalating what began as a neighborhood dispute into something far more dangerous. David's phone suddenly lit up with a message from his FBI contact. It was about a secure phone call he'd intercepted. It was a cartel leadership meeting in Mexico. They were talking about his neighborhood. David immediately knew this was a big deal. He studied satellite images of the area, looking for potential vulnerabilities. His military training told him this calm was temporary. It was just the prelude to a storm. Mrs. Martinez knocked on his door. She looked pale. "David, someone left this on my porch." She handed him a manila envelope. Inside were photos and surveillance shots of neighborhood children walking to school. To school, elderly residents at the market, families in their homes. The message was clear. The cartel had eyes everywhere, trying to terrorize us again. Mrs. Martinez whispered like the Iron Wolves did. David replied, examining the photos with professional interest. "They're showing their hand. These shots all come from the same angle, same time patterns. They want us to know they're watching, but they just revealed their surveillance positions." His radio crackled with Mr. Jenkins's voice, urgent and concerned. Movement at the old warehouse district, multiple vehicles. David noted that the heavily armed men were establishing a forward operating base, which was a classic cartel tactic. First intimidation, then a show of force, and finally territorial occupation. Officer Chin arrived with more troubling news. 3 former Iron Wolves members had been found dead, and a message had been carved into their chests. This was cartel territory. David's jaw tightened as he processed the news. It seemed the cartel was escalating faster than expected, trying to fill the power vacuum before the community could strengthen its defenses. "Chin, please contact your FBI liaison. We really need those warrant requests expedited. Jenkins, please maintain surveillance but do not engage. Martinez twins, please start evacuating our high-risk residents to the safe houses." He made sure to keep the residents safe at the safe houses. His volunteers had put in weeks of training and coordination, and they were now an effective defense force. Mrs. Martinez asked about the schools. David showed her his tablet, displaying a new security system. Every school now had retired veterans as security guards, high-resolution cameras, and panic buttons. No child in Cedar Grove will never be vulnerable again. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You play soldier in your little neighborhood, but you don't understand what's coming. The cartel doesn't negotiate. We take what we want." David allowed himself a little smile. "Actually, you don't understand what you're facing." Throughout the day, he monitored cartel movements through his surveillance network. They were professional, he had to admit. The operations were carried out with military precision, but there was one crucial mistake. They thought they were up against a neighborhood watch, but they hadn't realized they were actually facing a carefully coordinated resistance led by someone who'd spent decades studying asymmetrical warfare. The Martinez twins radioed in to the cartel soldiers, asking them to question people at the market to find any weak points. Gathering intel was their job. They were looking for weaknesses in the cartel's strategy. David replied, "Every person they threaten, every business they target just strengthens our case." His FBI contact called again. "Mitchell, it's worse than we thought. The cartel's not just sending soldiers. They're sending the cleaner, their top enforcer, former Special Forces, suspected in over 30 murders. Oh dear, David said quietly. Let's give him something to clean. As evening approached, David gathered his core team in his grandmother's living room. The room had become their command center. They'll hit us hard, he explained. But we've got something they don't expect. A community that won't break. Every threat makes us stronger. Every act of intimidation brings us closer together. Officer Chen studied the tactical displays. The department's compromised again. New cartel money, buying old corruption. Then we'll clean house again. David assured her this was never going to be a quick victory. We're not just fighting criminals, we're fighting a system that allows them to thrive. His secure radio crackled with Mr. Jenkins reporting from his observation post. Major unmarked vans were entering the warehouse, and district-heavy weapons were being unloaded. It looked like they were preparing for war. David checked his watch and was pleased to see that everything was proceeding according to his analysis. The cartel was predictable. They only knew one way to solve problems, but he was confident that they could handle it. He told his volunteers to stay strong and not let them intimidate them. Every move they make, every threat they issue, every weapon they bring, it all goes into our evidence files while they're preparing for a war. We're building a case that will destroy their entire operation. Mrs. Martinez touched his arm. David, what if they target you directly? These people aren't like the Iron Wolves, are they? He agreed. They're worse, which means we have to be better, smarter, and more determined. Outside, sighed the sunset over Cedar. The lights came on in homes that had once stayed dark in fear. Children were playing in yards that had been empty for months. The neighborhood was healing and finding its strength. But David knew the real fight was just beginning. The cartel wouldn't stop with threats and intimidation. They were coming to erase Cedar Grove's resistance and make an example of anyone who dared stand against them. They didn't understand that some things were worth any cost. David knew that strength didn't come from violence or fear. It came from protecting others. He thought to himself, let them come. He was sure that they were about to learn what the Iron Wolves had learned. They had declared war on a community that refused to surrender. Surrender wasn't in David Mitchell's vocabulary. The first sign of the cartel's real offensive came at midnight. It wasn't with violence, but with money. David watched through his surveillance. Network as luxury cars delivered men in expensive suits to City Hall for an emergency council meeting. They're buying the whole system, Officer Chen reported, monitoring police channels. New bribes, bigger promises, half the council already in their pocket. David had expected this. The cartel operated differently from street gangs. They corrupted from the top down. By morning, parking enforcement was ticketing cars outside resistant businesses. Health. Inspectors suddenly found violations at stores that supported the neighborhood watch. Building permits were mysteriously revoked. It's so sad. They're trying to strangle us legally, Mr. Thompson said during the emergency community meeting. My grocery store just lost its liquor license. There was no explanation, and it wasn't legally. David corrected him, saying, they're using the law as a weapon, but they don't understand what they're up against. He unveiled his counter-move, which was dozens of file boxes. The boxes contained financial records, surveillance footage, and documented bribe payments. David had learned from 20 years of military intelligence work to gather evidence of everything. He explained to the assembled group that every council member who voted against them was now being investigated for their offshore accounts. The same applied to every inspector who had suddenly found violations. Their connection to cartel shell companies was documented. They thought they were buying a system, but they were really building their own. Prison, his phone buzzed with a message from his FBI contact. The cleaner arrived last night, and sadly, there have already been 3 bodies found. He's sending a message. David studied the crime scene photos. The victims were former Iron Wolves members who'd refused to work with the cartel. Their deaths were meant to show the price of resistance. He told his volunteers, time to show them what real strength looks like. Throughout the day, Cedar Grove's resistance grew stronger when cartel soldiers tried to intimidate shop owners. They were happy to find veterans waiting when corrupt cops performed random searches. Residents were keen to film everything, and they recorded every move the cartel made. The Martinez twins radioed from their observation post to say that the cleaners were making moves. They'd spotted him meeting with former Iron Wolves at the abandoned factory. David replied, Chun, please notify the FBI. David was the perfect choice for Phase 3. He had a knack for turning the enemy's strength against them. The cartel had sent their top and strongest to break Cedar Grove's spirit. Instead, they'd given David the perfect target, As night fell, the cleaner made his move. David's surveillance cameras caught him approaching Mrs. Martinez's house. He was likely choosing her as an easy target to terrorize the community. But Mrs. Martinez wasn't alone. She had David's network behind her. David had anticipated this and was ready for it. As the cleaner picked her lock, silent figures moved into position. "Now dive," David commanded through his radio. Floodlights blazed, and the cleaner found himself surrounded by FBI tactical teams. Their weapons were trained on his position. His reputation for violence meant nothing against overwhelming force. "Miguel," the cleaner Sanchez, David's voice carried across the quiet street. "You're under arrest for 37 counts of first-degree murder." Degree murder. The poor guy was in way over his head. He tried to fight back, bless his heart, but he just wasn't up to it. He was good, though. Better than good. He was excellent. But not excellent enough against operators who'd trained for exactly this scenario. As the FBI led him away, David received another text from an unknown number. "You think one arrest changes anything? We own this city now. Check your accounts." David replied, "All of them within hours." The cartel's carefully constructed network began to crumble. Shell companies were exposed. Bank accounts were frozen. Every official they'd bribed suddenly faced a federal investigation. It was incredible. A cartel lieutenant was heard saying on intercepted communications, "How did they trace everything?" The answer was simple. David hadn't just been fighting the cartel, he'd been documenting their entire operation, building a case that would destroy their infrastructure back at his command center. David briefed his volunteers. The cartel made the same mistake as the Iron Wolves. They thought fear was their greatest weapon. They never understood that documentation, evidence, and community solidarity are more powerful than violence. Officer Chun brought fresh intelligence. "They're pulling back, regrouping, but David, there's chatter about bringing in heavy hitters from Mexico, real killers." "Let them come," David said quietly. "Every enforcer they send, every dollar they spend, every threat they make just strengthens our position. They don't understand. We're not just defending a neighborhood anymore. We're dismantling their entire operation." Mrs. Martinez served coffee to the volunteers. Her hands no longer shook when sirens passed. "David, what you've done, it's more than just protecting us. You've given us back our dignity." David studied the tactical displays. The cartel were adapting and changing their strategies, but so were we. Each confrontation made our community stronger and more united. "They'll try again, but we'll be ready." He warned his people that the cartel doesn't accept defeat easily, but neither do we. Outside Cedar Grove, it was another peaceful night. Neighbors were chatting across fences, and children were sleeping safely in their beds. The cartel would send more soldiers, more money, more threats, but they would learn what the Iron Wolves learned, what the cleaner learned. They hadn't just targeted a neighborhood, they'd awakened a community that refused to be victimized. They challenged a warrior who knew that some battles weren't just worth fighting, they were worth winning at any cost. The cartel's response came at dawn, not with violence but with lawyers, dozens of them filing lawsuits. The cartel is trying to make things difficult for David and his volunteers, the Neighborhood Watch, and anyone else who dares to resist. "They're trying to make us pay a lot in legal fees," Officer Chin explained, dropping another stack of court papers on David's desk. "There are harassment claims, civil rights violations, and defamation suits." David looked at the documents with a grim smile. "They still don't understand," he said. "Every lawsuit requires discovery, and every claim needs evidence. They're not attacking us. They're just trying to give us legal access." Their entire operation was thrown into chaos when his phone rang. It was the FBI contact, sounding worried. "The Mitchell cartel leadership is furious. They've never failed to take territory before, so they're calling in specialists. Not just killers, extortionists, blackmailers, experts in psychological warfare." "Perfect," David replied. "Let them waste resources. Every specialist they send is another thread we can pull to unravel their organization." Throughout the morning, David watched the cartel's new tactics unfold. The tactics were laid bare, and the local media suddenly ran stories questioning the Neighborhood Watch's methods. Anonymous sources claimed David was a dangerous vigilante, and social media was filled with orchestrated outrage. "They're trying to turn public opinion against us," Mrs. Martinez told him, showing him the latest news reports. David corrected her gently. "They're showing their desperation," he said. "Each false story, each planted narrative gives us more evidence of their coordination." His secure radio crackled with the news that Mr. Jenkins was reporting from his observation post. He had spotted some interesting visitors at the cartel's meeting. It seemed that they were meeting with former city officials, judges, and even some state legislators. David ordered that everything should be documented. The visitors were actually building an alliance, but they were unaware that they were being watched. By midday, the pressure had intensified. Building inspectors had condemned 3 supportive businesses, and the health department had also got involved. The restaurant licenses were suspended, and the police conducted random traffic stops on the neighborhood watch volunteers. But Seagrove had changed. Instead of cowering, the residents filmed every interaction and didn't pay bribes. The business owners documented every inspection. The cartel's bureaucratic warfare backfired, creating a paper trail of corruption. They're getting desperate. Officer Chen noted that they were monitoring police channels, and the chatter suggests they're planning something. David checked his historical displays. The cartel had learned from their previous failures, but they still didn't understand what they were really fighting. Chen activated protocol, and Jenkins alerted all observation posts. Martinez's twins began evacuation procedures. His volunteers moved with practice, efficiency, implementing plans they'd rehearsed dozens of times within hours. Thankfully, the risk residents were relocated to safe houses, and surveillance coverage was doubled every approach to Cedar Grove. The neighborhood was transformed into a fortress, which was a great idea. However, Chen pointed out that it was more than just defending streets. It was protecting homes and families and lives. David was really worried. He knew that you'd made some powerful enemies, and he was right. We all have a breaking point, and it looks like yours is coming up. Evening was approaching, and the cartels knew that they had to start defending themselves. They began with precision strikes at the community's weakest points. They made anonymous calls to child services, targeted supporting families, and even had tax auditors appear at resistant businesses and buildings. Code violations seemed to be multiplying, but David had anticipated this. He made sure to document each false report and create evidence of correlation for each targeted audit. The CL's attempts to use the system as a weapon became proof of their corruption. The Martinez twins radioed in to say they were moving in. They were specialists, former intelligence operatives, and psychological warfare experts. David replied, "Let them come. Another specialist is coming in from the command center." David has been studying the pattern of cartel movements. They are learning and adapting, but so is Cedar Grove. Each new tactic has strengthened the community's resolve. They think they are fighting a neighborhood, but David has explained to his volunteers that they are actually facing a movement. Every person they threaten and every business they target is just. This is another piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Martinez brought coffee to the watchers. David, these people aren't just criminals, they have real power and real connections. I agree, and that's their weakness. The bigger their network, the more vulnerabilities they create. Every corrupt official, every bought judge, every compromised cop is another point of failure outside Cedar Grove, prepared for another night of. We must be vigilant, but the atmosphere has changed. Where there was once fear, there is now determination. Where there was once isolation, there is now unity. The cartel will send more specialists, more lawyers, and more threats, but they will learn what the Iron Wolves learned. That they have not just challenged a neighborhood, but awakened a community that understands true strength comes not from violence or fear, but from standing together. Together against those who would rule through intimidation, and David Mitchell was just getting started. "Let them come," he murmured, watching his tactical displays. They're about to learn that some enemies can't be bought, some communities can't be broken, and some battles are worth any price. The war for Cedar Grove's soul wasn't entering a new phase, but this time, the defenders weren't just fighting back. They were winning. David was pleased to see that they were winning. He'd discovered the cartel's next move during his morning intelligence review. It was a series of mysterious real estate transactions sweeping through Cedar Grove. They were buying properties through shell companies. Officer Chen explained that they were spreading property records across his desk. There were apartment buildings, storefronts, and even private homes. They'd all been purchased at triple market value. David studied the pattern and saw that it was a classic encirclement strategy. He realized that the cartel wasn't just buying buildings. They were trying to control access points, surveillance positions, and defensive strongholds. His secure phone lit up with an urgent message from his FBI contact, Mitchell. It was a worrying message. It seemed that the cartel had infiltrated the City Planning Commission and were targeting new zoning laws at David's neighborhood. Tonight, the cartel had learned from their previous failures. Instead of using brute force, they were using bureaucracy as a weapon. They were controlling properties, manipulating zoning, and forcing out resistant residents. Clever, David admitted, but the strategy was predictable. Throughout the morning, he watched it unfold. Long-time residents received eviction notices, and business owners faced rent increases. Mr. Wong popped by the command center with some papers. He said they'd offered 5 times what his store was worth, and that if he didn't sell, they'd condemn the building. Did he sign anything? David asked. No, my father built this store. Some things aren't for sale, Mr. Wong replied. David smiled. Good, because they just made their first major mistake. He activated his surveillance. Network every property transaction, every permit denial, every zoning change. This created a documented pattern. The cartel thought they were using the system, but they were actually exposing their entire operation. Mr. Jenkins radioed from his observation post and got eyes on some interesting meetings. Cartel lawyers with city officials, real estate agents, bank managers, they recorded everything. David ordered them to do so, and they thought they were building an empire. They're actually documenting a criminal conspiracy. By afternoon, the pressure intensified. Code violations appeared on resistant properties. Tax assessments skyrocketed. Insurance companies canceled policies. But Cedar Grove had changed. Instead of surrendering, residents fought back with paperwork. They appealed every violation, challenged every assessment, and questioned every cancellation. Oh, they're trying to make our lives difficult, Mrs. Martinez. I'm sorry, but that's not quite right. They're making themselves difficult. Every legal document, every official action, creates evidence we can use. His phone buzzed with another threat. Everything has a price. Everyone can be bought. You're fighting the inevitable, David said. His response was simple. Some things aren't for sale. As evening approached, he gathered his core team. Tactical displays showed the cartel's property acquisition spreading like a cancer through the neighborhood. He explained that they think they're being subtle, using legal means and legitimate businesses, but they don't understand what they're really fighting. Officer Chen studied the pattern they're creating, a noose tightening it slowly. They've made a critical error, assuming we're defending. We're not in territory, we're protecting something they can't understand. We're protecting community history and our homes through his surveillance network. David watched cartel operatives meeting with city officials, money changing hands, promises being made. The system they'd corrupted was working exactly as they planned. The Martinez twins reported they're moving in professional management companies and private security firms. David replied, let them invest more resources. Every dollar they spend and every company they create just adds to our evidence pile. Mrs. Martinez served coffee to the watchers. David, these people, they can just buy whatever they want. How can we possibly compete with that kind of money? It's like trying to buy loyalty and a sense of community purpose. They think everything has a price tag, but they've never encountered anything priceless outside of Cedar Grove. So we settled into another night of vigilance, but the atmosphere wasn't fearful. The cartel expected to find us weakening, but we were stronger than ever. The resolve they found was strengthening their determination to keep coming. David told his volunteers that they'll keep coming, and that they'll need more money, more lawyers, and more pressure. But they don't understand what they're facing. His phone lit up with yet another threat. Your neighborhood is already ours. You just don't know it yet. David smiled grimly. The cartel still didn't understand. They thought they were just buying buildings and controlling territory, but they didn't realize they were fighting something that couldn't be purchased. The human spirit let them come with their money, he murmured, watching his tactical displays. They were trying to buy what can't be sold, and their David was about to learn that some things are beyond price. The war for Cedar Grove had entered a new phase, but this time the defenders weren't just fighting for their homes. They were fighting for their souls, and that was something no amount of money could conquer. The cartel's frustration manifested in an unexpected way. David noticed at first in his morning intelligence briefing that their communication patterns had changed. They were getting erratic and desperate. Major Jenkins radioed in overnight and told him that they were moving in new players, different from the usual muscle. These guys looked professional. David watched through his network as unmarked vans delivered a team of men carrying sophisticated electronic equipment. They weren't thugs or soldiers this time. They were technical specialists. They were escalating to cyber warfare. He informed his core team, trying to crack our surveillance network and compromise our communications. Officer Chen brought more troubling news. They've hired a team of private investigators, and they're digging into everyone's past, including you, the volunteers, and even supporters. David had anticipated this phase when money and muscle failed. Enemies always turned to information warfare, and the cartel was hoping to find secrets, vulnerabilities, and pressure points. He told his team that every investigation they launch gives us more evidence of their coordination. Besides, he smiled grimly, they're not the only ones who know how to gather intelligence. Throughout the morning, David watched their new strategy unfold. Neighborhood Watch volunteers received emails containing personal information, subtle reminders that they were being watched. Business owners found their private financial records mysteriously leaked online. Mrs. Martinez rushed in clutching her laptop. David, they're posting things about my late husband. Things that aren't true. They're trying to divide us. He explained. Create doubt. Breed mistrust. Mistrust is a classic psychological warfare tactic, but Cedar Grove had evolved beyond such manipulation. Instead of hiding from the exposures, residents shared them openly. Every attempted blackmail became another documented cartel tactic. The Martinez twins reported that they've got hackers hitting the neighborhood security network. The network is trying to blind our cameras. Good, David replied. It means they're getting desperate. Desperate enemies make mistakes. His FBI contact called with urgent news. Mitchell, David said, they're not just using tech specialists. They've hired a team of former intelligence operatives. These guys are good, David said. Real professionals. Perfect. He'd prepared for this. His military experience had taught him that technology was just a tool. The real strength lay in people. They think they're fighting a security system. He explained to his volunteers that they don't understand. They're facing a community. Technology can be hacked. People's resolve cannot. David was buzzing with another threat. Everyone has secrets. Everyone has weaknesses. We will find yours. David's response was characteristic. Secrets don't matter when you're not ashamed of who you are. As evening approached, he gathered his core team. The tactical displays showed the cartel's digital siege spreading across Cedar Grove. They're trying to blind us, Officer Chin noted, watching the security cameras go dark. No, David corrected her. They're exposing themselves. Every attack creates evidence and every probe leaves traces. They think they're gathering intelligence, but they're actually building our case through their backup systems. David monitored the cartel operators meeting with their new specialists. Money flowed, plans were made. They thought they were launching a sophisticated cyber assault. Major Mr. Jenkins radioed. They're setting up some kind of electronic warfare center in the old warehouse district. David replied, let them establish their infrastructure. Every piece of equipment they install becomes evidence we can use. Mrs. Martinez brought coffee to the watchers. Her face worried David. These people, they can find out everything about us. How do we fight that kind of power? By understanding what they don't. He answered, they think information is power, but they don't understand that real strength comes from what we stand for, not what we hide. Outside Cedar Grove, they were prepared for another night of digital warfare, but the atmosphere wasn't fearful. Where the cartel expected to find panic over exposed secrets, they found acceptance and unity. They'll keep digging, David told his volunteers. They're looking for weaknesses, vulnerabilities, pressure points, but they don't understand what they're really fighting. His phone lit up with yet another threat. Your defenses are already compromised, you just don't know it yet. David smiled grimly. The cartel still didn't understand. They thought they were fighting a security system, a surveillance network. They didn't realize they were up against something that couldn't be hacked, the human spirit. Let them come with their technology, he murmured, watching his backup displays. Let them try to break what can't be broken. They're about to learn that some things are beyond their reach. The war. Cedar Grove had entered a digital phase, but this time the defenders weren't just protecting data. They were also protecting their dignity, and that was something no computer could crack. The cartel's digital assault backfired spectacularly at midnight. David had been waiting for this moment, watching through backup systems. As their hackers breached what they thought was the neighborhood's main security network, Officer Chin reported monitoring the fake systems David had set up as a trap, downloading everything perfectly. David smiled, letting them take it all. What the cartel's tech specialists didn't realize was that they weren't. They were just downloading surveillance footage, but they were actually installing a very sophisticated tracking program. It was designed by David's own cyber warfare contacts. Major Jenkins radioed excitedly. Their command center is lighting up like a Christmas tree. Every computer, every phone, every device connected to their network is now giving us complete access to their entire operation. David finished. Sometimes the best way to catch a predator is to let it think it's caught you. Throughout the night, data flowed into David's secure servers. Financial records, communication logs, operation plans. The cartel's overconfidence had given him exactly what he needed. Mrs. Martinez arrived at dawn, bringing fresh coffee to the overnight watchers. David showed her his real displays while they celebrated their supposed victory. They were mapping their whole organization. His FBI contact called, sounding impressed. "This is incredible," he said. "Their encryption just collapsed. We're seeing connections to corrupt officials across 3 states," David explained. They never understood what they were really fighting. They were so caught up in the territory of power that they didn't realize it was about justice. By morning, the cartel's celebration had turned to panic. Their successful hack had compromised their own security. Every attempt to shut down their systems just spread David's program further. The poor Martinez twins reported that their tech teams are going crazy. They're trying to purge their systems, but it's too late. David finished. Sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun or a badge, it's a line of code. His phone buzzed with a frantic message from an unknown number. "What have you done? Do you know who you're dealing with?" David's response was simple. "Now everyone will know who you're dealing with throughout the day." He watched the cartel's digital empire crumble. Their encrypted communications became transparent. Their hidden accounts were exposed. Their entire network of corruption laid bare. "They're running scared," Officer Chun noted, monitoring police channels. "Their lawyers are jumping ship. Their corrupt officials are resigning because they finally understand." David explained to his volunteers. "They thought they were fighting a neighborhood watch. Instead, they gave us the keys to their kingdom." Mrs. Martinez watched the news reports in amazement. All those powerful people. All those connections. Nothing compared to the power of truth. David smiled. "It's incredible, isn't it? All those powerful people, all those connections, and yet the power of truth is so much greater. We just need to shine a light on it." He turned to his secure radio. "Mr. Jenkins reporting from my observation post. There's a lot going on at their command center. They're destroying equipment and burning documents." "Let them burn." David looked at his team. "We've got everything we need. As the evening approaches, I'd like to gather my core team." The displays are showing the cartel's organization dissolving in real time. It seems they thought technology was their advantage. David smiled. He explained that they never understood that every weapon can be turned against its wielder through his network. David watched the cartel leaders fleeing. Their carefully constructed facade of legitimacy was shattered. "What happens now?" Officer Chan asked. David smiled. He replied, "We show them what real justice looks like." His phone lit up with one last threat. "This isn't over. No one crosses the cartel and lives." David knew it was over. The cartel had made the same mistake as the Iron Wolves. They'd underestimated what a united community could achieve. "Let them make threats," he thought. He told his volunteers that they were about to learn some important lessons. Some enemies can't be intimidated, some truths can't be hidden, and some victories can't be stopped. Outside Cedar Grove, the night settled into a peaceful rhythm. The community was free from fear and tension, thanks to the cell's digital warfare. The best weapon of all is the truth, and the truth David knew was more powerful than any army. The war for Cedar Grove's soul had reached its turning point. The defenders hadn't just protected their homes, they'd exposed an empire of corruption. And now justice would finally be served. News of the cartel implosion spread like wildfire, filling Cedar Grove with a new energy. Residents gathered in the streets, sharing stories of resilience, unity, and the power of truth. David watched from his porch, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. They had won more than just a battle. They had reclaimed their community spirit. But he knew the work wasn't finished. Corruption had deep roots, and justice would require more than just exposing the truth. It would demand accountability, reform, and a commitment to rebuild what had been broken. His phone buzzed with a call from his FBI contact. "Mitchell, the Attorney General, would love to have a chat with you about what you've uncovered. It's bigger than we ever imagined." David smiled and told her, "I'm ready to get to work." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Federal agents poured into Cedar Grove, following the evidence trail David had provided. He'd done a great job. Lots of arrests were made, assets seized, and corrupt officials indicted. The scale of the cartel's influence shocked even the most cynical observers. But David's focus remained on his community. He worked tirelessly with his volunteers, helping displaced families find new homes. Mrs. Martinez was there to help businesses reopen and support residents, as well as processing the trauma they'd endured. One evening, she found him poring over rebuilding plans in his grandmother's study. "David, I've been thinking we need more than just repaired buildings. We need to prepare the soul of our community. The lovely Martinez twins, who have lots of experience in construction, led the renovation work. Officer Chen was able to get funding for the project through seized cartel assets. Mrs. Martinez poured her heart and soul into designing programs for young people, seniors, and families as the center took shape. So did a new sense of purpose in Cedar Grove. The fear that had once haunted the streets gave way to determination. The isolation to connection, slowly but surely, helped the wounds left by the Iron Wolves and the cartel to begin to heal. Just 3 months to the day after the cartel's fall, the Cedar Grove Community Center held its the grand opening was a truly special day. Hundreds of people came together to celebrate, filling the once-abandoned library with laughter, music, and the aroma of Mrs. Martinez's famous tamales. David stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces. There were the old-timers who'd seen the neighborhood through good times and bad, the young families just starting to put down roots, and the volunteers who had become like family. Each of them had played a part in the extraordinary journey that brought them to this moment. My grandmother used to say that a community is only as strong as the stories it tells about itself. The story of Cedar Grove has been written by those who sought to control through fear for too long. But today we're reclaiming our story. He spoke of resilience in the face of terror, of unity in the face of division, and of the indomitable human spirit that had refused to be broken. He spoke of the amazing power of truth to shatter even the most deeply rooted corruption, and the incredible power of justice to heal even the deepest wounds. The battle for Cedar Grove's soul was not won by any one person. He said it was won by all of us, by every single person who refused to be intimidated, every voice that he spoke out against injustice, and he encouraged everyone to do the same. He showed great courage and compassion in the face of cruelty. As he closed David's eyes, he settled on a framed photo near the podium. His grandmother's warm smile and sparkling eyes, filled with fiery determination, filled his heart with joy. He remembered how his grandmother believed in the promise of this community. She believed that together, we could overcome any challenge, no matter what storms we faced. She gave her life to that belief. Although she didn't live to see this day, he knew she'd be proud of what they'd achieved, not just in removing the evil that threatened them, but in the ties we made, the community we built, the story we've started to write together. He raised a glass and gave a heartfelt toast, his voice ringing with emotion for Cedar Grove. May we keep writing a story of hope, resilience, and unity, and may we never forget the power of a community that stands together. As the celebration stretched into the evening, David found a quiet moment to slip away to his grandmother's grave. He laid a bouquet of her favorite yellow roses against the headstone, fingers tracing the inscription. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something, we did it, Gran. We took back our home, but it was never really about winning a war, was it? It was about building peace, about protecting not just a place, but the people who make it worth fighting for. He thought of the community center, the laughter of children, and the chatter of neighbors echoing through once empty halls. He thought of Officer Chun, who'd found her voice as a leader of the Martinez, and twins channeling their skills into creation rather than conflict. And Mrs. Martinez, whose tamales were more than just food. They were, and it was a symbol of love and a reminder of the nurturing spirit that held them all together. The Iron Wolves thought they could break us, the cartel thought they could buy us, but they never understood what really makes a community strong. It's not about territory or power or money. It's about the unbreakable bonds between people who look out for each other, who lift each other up, who refuse to let each other fall. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint strains of music from the celebration. David closed his eyes, letting the truth of the moment wash over him. We won. Grandpa was more than just against criminals and corrupt people. He helped us achieve something really special, the chance to start a new story. A story about a neighborhood that became a family, and a family that became unbreakable. He placed a hand on the headstone, making a silent promise. That's a story that will never end. As he walked back towards the community center, towards the lights, laughter, and love, David knew his journey in Cedar Grove was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, and more stories to write. But he also knew he would never have to fight them alone. He had an army at his back now, an army of neighbors, friends, and family. This army was united not by fear or force, but by an unshakable commitment to each other. This was an army of ordinary heroes who had looked evil in the face and said, "Not in our neighborhood. Not on our watch." David smiled with heartfelt joy as he stepped back into the celebration. This was just the beginning. and he couldn't wait to see what the next chapter held. Now, Cedar Grove was more than just a dot on a map. It was a beacon, a shining example of what happens when people stand together, fight together, and believe together.